simmering feud with the formidable Currie sisters pulls Hamish Macbeth into a battle of wills that quickly turns troublesome. In Loch Dhu, even old grudges can spark new mysteries. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. The peat fire had died again, and Hamish sat hunched at the station desk, staring at the pile of forms Blair had sent the night before. They lay there like a row of smug little graves. Lugg slept under the desk, but one ear twitched as if even he disliked the smell of bureaucracy. Hamish had just taken up his pen in the half-hearted way he always did, when he meant to avoid real work when the dog's head lifted. A low whine came from his throat. "Ah, what now?" Hamish muttered. The telephone rang. Patel's voice arrived in a strained whisper, as if the whole of Loch Dhu might be listening through the line. He always sounded like that when something annoyed him. "You must come at once," he said. "There is a scandal nailed to the kirk door." Hamish set down the pen with relief. "What kind?" "A wicked sort," Patel said. "You'll see." Luggs was already at the door, tail stiff, as if he intended to drag Hamish there himself. Hamish shrugged on his damp coat. The morning was raw, a thin drizzle drifting along the road like an old woman searching for gossip. He walked up the hill toward the kirk. Loch Dhu lay quiet, but the kind of quiet that meant everyone was awake and talking behind curtains. A knot of villagers stood around the kirk door. They drew back when Hamish approached, though not far enough to be polite. Their breath steamed a little in the cold. The Currie sisters were at the front, standing shoulder to shoulder like a row of sour judges. Jessie held a sheet of paper. She was reading it aloud in the same tone she used when reminding people of their sins at committee meetings. "It accuses me," Patel said, darting forward, "of cheating the customers. Me. As if I would need to cheat anyone for a few pennies of lentils." Hamish leaned in and studied the leaflet. It was badly typed, the letters faint here and too dark there, and there was a strong smell of duplicating ink. He lifted it closer to his nose. A smear of blue clung to the back, like someone had handled it without waiting for the ribbon to dry. Peggy Currie clicked her tongue. "It says he gives short measures," she said. "Think of it, folk depending on him for their groceries." "You'll need to act, Hamish," Jessie added. "This is a sin and a crime." Patel looked sick. The villagers murmured approval at the idea of punishment, although Hamish noticed at least 3 of them routinely took extra sugar sachets from the hotel cafe without paying. "It's a daft prank," Hamish said. "I'll see to it." Peggy fixed him with a sharp eye. "You're too soft. Folk will talk." "They already are," Nessie whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I heard people at the post office saying they go to Strathbane for their shopping. Safer there." Hamish doubted Strathbane was safer for anything except catching diseases. Still, he did not argue. He felt the damp starting to creep through the seams of his coat. Luggs pressed close to his leg, uneasy at all the muttering. "Where did this come from?" Hamish asked. "Found it nailed to the door when I opened the kirk hall," said Mrs. Drummond, who fancied herself the upholder of all moral order. "Imagine, on a Sunday morning." "It's Friday, Mrs. Drummond," Hamish reminded her, but she only sniffed. At that moment, the postmistress appeared, arms folded, face tight. "No such leaflet passed through my hands," she said. "No local stamp. Someone didn't use the post at all, just came creeping about." The Currie sisters nodded as though this proved one of their enemies guilty. They had many enemies, though most of them did not know it. Hamish folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He would have liked to go home, relight the fire, and forget the whole matter. Instead, he walked through the village, checking to see if any more leaflets were pinned about. Lugg stayed close, ears flicking toward passing whispers. Outside Patel's shop, a pair of tourists were arguing. One of them held a brown paper bag as though it contained explosives. "These carrots are smaller than the ones on display," the woman said. "I want the ones I chose." Patel stood behind the counter, pale. "Madam, that is the size they always were." The woman gave him a look of pure suspicion. "We heard rumours." Hamish stepped inside. "No rumours worth repeating," he said. "Just someone with nothing better to do." The woman stared at his uniform as if it were meant to impress her. It did not. She left with a sniff. Patel sagged. "You see? Why would anyone do this to me?" Hamish shrugged. "Folk get bored." "That's no answer," Patel said, lowering his voice. "There's talk of some English writer staying at Tommel Castle. asking questions. Maybe she wants a scandal for one of her books. You know what these literary types are like. No morals at all. Hamish doubted writers stayed awake long enough to ruin grocers, but he did not say so. Patel was in no mood for logic. When he got back to the station, the phone rang again. This time it was Blair. "I hear there's trouble in your wee village," Blair said. "Leaflets everywhere. You let the place run wild, Macbeth, no discipline." "It's one sheet," Hamish said. "Probably a prank." "You'd like it to be a prank. Daviot doesn't want embarrassment. You keep a tight grip or I'll come up there myself." The line clicked off. Hamish leaned back in his chair. Lugs whined again, as if even he disliked the sound of Blair's name. The damp in the station walls crept down into the floorboards. Hamish wished he had lit the fire earlier. By late afternoon, the drizzle steadied into a thin, constant fall that made Loch Dhu look like it had been drawn in pencil. He walked past Patel's shop again. Fewer customers than usual. Those who came in did so with stiff backs as though performing a civic duty. The gossip had taken root. It always did. Nessie Currie intercepted him near the telephone box. She never wasted an opportunity. "That English writer's been asking questions," she said. "Says she's doing a book about village life. I said nothing, of course, but she pries. She's always in the hotel lounge, scribbling away as if she knows better than us." Hamish had met a few writers. They all behaved as if they knew better than everyone. "What sort of questions?" "About reputations, past scandals, folk we shouldn't mention. You be careful. These outsiders twist things." Hamish nodded and walked on. A faint wind carried the scent of the loch, mixed with peat smoke from cottage fires. It should have been a comforting smell, but today it felt sour. He returned to the station and laid the leaflet on the desk. Examining it again did not help. The type looked too uneven for a modern machine, but not old enough to be ancient. The blue smear on the back was fresh. Lugg sat down beside him with a heavy sigh. Hamish scratched the dog's head. "It'll blow over," he murmured. But he was not sure. The evening grew quiet. He locked the station door early and went to make tea. As he waited for the kettle to boil, he thought about Patel's face at the kirk. The man had lived in Loch Dhu long enough to know the villagers' strengths and weaknesses, yet he still looked surprised when they turned. Hamish carried his mug back to the desk. The leaflet lay there, ugly and small. A bad business. A slow one, too. These things spread through the village like cold seeping into stone. Outside, footsteps passed, then paused, then hurried on. People avoiding being seen. People talking behind hands. Luggs lay down with his nose on his paws, watching the door. Hamish took another drink of tea, wishing it was stronger. By nightfall, the quiet had turned into something harder, a kind of held breath. Hamish knew the village. Something this petty could turn sharp if left alone. He should have gone door to door and insisted on answers, but he had not. He had treated it like a nuisance, and now it was growing. He banked the fire, let Luggs out and back in, and finally sat again at the desk. He looked at the pile of forms. He looked at the leaflet. Blair would call again tomorrow and make a fuss. Daviot would send a memo. The villagers would stir themselves into a quarrel. He rubbed his eyes. The night pressed at the windows like damp cloth. This business was not over. It was only beginning its turn. The morning began badly and stayed there. When Hamish opened the station door, Luggs growled, a low, uneasy sound that meant something nasty waited outside. Hamish felt it too, a heaviness in the air the weather could not explain. The wind had returned in sharp bursts, the sort that slapped the back of the neck like a reprimand. He had not taken 3 steps before he saw it. Another leaflet lay on the mat, neatly folded as if someone thought manners softened malice. He picked it up and read enough to feel his stomach sink. Mrs. McPhee this time. Words about entertaining gentlemen and cheating her guests. The tone was uglier, and the typing a bit steadier than yesterday's, though still uneven. "Well now," he muttered, "folk really are bored." Before he could fold it away, the door burst open and the Currie sisters marched in without waiting to be invited. Jessie thrust her own copy at him as though he might deny the one in his hand. "You can't ignore it now," she snapped. "Our village is becoming a cesspit. Next thing, the newspapers will say it's all your fault." Peggy gave a stiff nod. Nessie hovered behind them, eyes gleaming with the excitement of disaster. Luggs moved to Hamish's side, ears flat. Hamish rubbed the back of his neck. "I've not ignored anything. I'm dealing with it." "You're not dealing with it," Jessie said. "You're pretending it'll vanish. Meanwhile, folk are whispering that Mrs. McPhee has men coming and going at all hours." Hamish thought privately that Mrs. McPhee did have a few too many visitors, but most of them were relatives or men who wanted tea and sympathy. He would not say it aloud. He folded the leaflet into his pocket. "I'll speak with her," he said. "You'll interrogate her," Peggy corrected. "People expect it." "People expect too much," Hamish replied, but softly. The three sisters left as abruptly as they had arrived, satisfied they had done their duty. Hamish locked the station door behind them, though it was pointless. Anyone in Loch Dhu could open that lock if they wanted to. He told Lugs, "Come on then," and headed for Mrs. McPhee's bed and breakfast. She answered the door at once, as if waiting for trouble. Her eyes were red and her hair was pinned more tightly than usual, which meant she was furious. "You've seen it," she said. "Of course you have. Everyone has. Someone wants my ruin." Hamish tried to be gentle. "Aye, it's cruel stuff. I'll get it stopped." "You said that yesterday," she said. "And today I'm a woman of loose morals, a disgrace, a cheat. You know what these visitors are like. They want cleanliness and quiet. Now they think I run a brothel." He winced. "No one thinks that." "You think that," she shot back. Hamish opened his mouth to deny it, but stopped. He had wondered, slightly, just slightly, but Loch Dhu never needed much to fill in the gaps. "I'll speak to the villagers," he said instead. "Folk should mind their own business." Mrs. McPhee looked at him as if he were a child. "They never will, not here." He noticed a stack of envelopes on her hall table, all addressed to relatives. She had been writing letters. She would deny it, but she was frightened. A crash of wind hit the roof, and she flinched. Hamish left, feeling useless. He wished he could blame Strathbane, but this trouble belonged to Loch Dhu. By the afternoon, the wind had turned into sharp rain. Hamish had barely settled back at the station when the phone rang again. This time it was a young tourist, voice shaking, insisting he had found a woman by the loch. "A body," he said. "She's not moving." Hamish felt a chill not caused by the weather. He grabbed his coat and ran, Lugs pacing him. The sky hung low, flat and grey, pushing down on the village as though the whole place were guilty. They reached the rocky stretch by the water where the caller waited. Miss Cole lay on her side, her coat catching on a stone. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands. Hamish knelt, touched her wrist, then let it fall. Lugs whined. There were skid marks on the slope, the kind left by someone who had lost their footing. The rocks were slick. It could have been an accident. Could have been. Blair arrived minutes later in a Strathbane car, soaked and smug. Anderson followed like a shadow. Blair strode forward and barked, "What have you done now, Macbeth?" letting the place turn into a circus. Hamish stood up slowly. "She slipped. Looks like it." "Looks like carelessness on your part," Blair snapped. "You've let some local lunatic stir up poison pen nonsense, and now the first victim appears." Hamish hated the way Blair said victim, as though the whole matter excited him. Blair bent down and plucked something from Miss Cole's coat pocket. It was a leaflet, the one about Mrs. McPhee. "Well, well," Blair said, "your poison pen strikes again." "It doesn't prove anything," Hamish said. "It proves you're incompetent," Blair retorted. "Daviot will have plenty to say." Anderson hovered behind Blair, nodding like a dog hoping for scraps. Hamish turned away and looked at the ground. There were small footprints, the kind a woman with narrow feet might leave. One of the Currie sisters had feet like that. Nessie especially. She often walked by the loch in the evenings, claiming she needed air after village strain. The prints disappeared when the path hit the grass, but they were there. He also saw a broken twig nearby with a faint smear of blue at the end. It reminded him of the ink on the leaflet. "Stop staring at the bushes," Blair said. "We've got the cause. Suicide or despair. Press will love it." Hamish's jaw tightened. She was a writer. She was poking about. "Someone may have—" Blair cut him off. "Someone may have nothing. You're trying to cover your back. This is your mess, not Strathbane's." Behind them, a few villagers had gathered at a careful distance. They muttered to each other in low voices. Hamish heard snatches. Driven to it. She knew too much. These things don't happen in decent places. One woman said, "If she found out about Mrs. McPhee's carry-on, who knows what else she heard?" Another said, "Poor thing, must have been terrified." Hamish wanted to tell them to stop, but he knew it would not help. The story had already changed 3 times, and the truth had not appeared in any version. Blair ordered Anderson to cordon off the area. Anderson fumbled the tape and managed to tie it in a knot that served no purpose. Blair glared at Hamish as though it were his fault. "You'll write a full report," Blair said. And don't leave anything out. Daviot wants detail, even your little theories." Hamish said nothing. He looked toward the footprints again, but Blair shoved past and blocked his view. "Your chance to play detective is finished," Blair said. "Real police are here." The rain eased to a spit. Luggs sat with his ears down, watching Hamish. The villagers drifted off, satisfied they had seen enough to tell a more colourful version later. When everyone had gone, Hamish walked a few steps away from the body. The loch looked flat and sullen. He felt the old heaviness settle in his chest. Miss Cole had been alive that morning, probably planning to nose into more gossip by tea time. Now she was lying on cold stones with Blair calling it suicide, and the village half convinced she had died of their secrets. He knelt again and looked at the crumpled leaflet in Blair's evidence bag. Mrs. McPhee would suffer for this. The village would not forget it. And the Currie sisters would enjoy being at the centre of the storm, whether they admitted it or not. A gull screamed overhead. Luggs nudged Hamish's elbow, confused and sad. Hamish scratched the dog's head. He wished it were as simple as Blair thought, but it wasn't. Nothing in Loch Dhu ever stayed simple. He stood and stared at the path, the broken twig, the faint smear of blue. He reached out to touch it, then stopped. Blair would twist it against him. Better to wait. The wind shifted, cold and steady, carrying the scent of wet reeds. Hamish felt the wrongness of it all. Too many lies, too much gossip, too quick a leap from scandal to death. This was only the second day of trouble, and already Loch Dhu felt stranger to him. He took a last look at the loch, then turned back toward the village, feeling the weight of the next steps pressing down like the rain that threatened again. Rain hammered the village as if it meant to shove the roofs into the loch. By morning, the whole place felt squeezed flat. Every window steamed, every door shut tight against the wet. Hamish had not slept. Villagers had rung him until well past midnight, each certain they alone held the key to Miss Cole's death. None of them had anything useful, but they all wanted to be heard. Luggs lay under the desk now, ears flicking every time the wind rattled the tin guttering. The telephone shrilled again. Hamish lifted it with a grunt. Anderson's eager voice chirped down the line. "Daviot wants results, Macbeth. A clean explanation, before the press gets wind of a poison pen suicide in a Highland backwater." Hamish stared at the wall. "It's not a suicide yet." "You say that. Daviot doesn't." Anderson paused, lowering his voice as if Blair were listening behind him. "Expect the inspector shortly." Hamish put the receiver down hard enough that Luggs winced. Shortly was 10 minutes. Blair stormed into the station in a wet coat that smelled of petrol and triumph. Anderson trailed behind him like a damp echo. Blair slapped a folder onto the desk and said, "Your lassie at the B&B did it." Hamish blinked. "What lassie?" "That McPhee woman." Blair puffed out his chest. "Obvious suspect. She had motive, shame, and a tongue like a fishwife. The leaflets, Macbeth. She's the troubled type." Hamish rubbed his forehead. He was too tired for Blair's version of logic. "She's angry, not troubled." "She embarrassed?" "Aye, and folk who get embarrassed get desperate." Blair leaned in. "You agree with me?" Hamish should have said no. He should have said plenty. Instead, the memory of Mrs. McPhee snapping at him the day before rose up, sharp as vinegar. All those men dropping by her place at odd hours. Relatives, she'd said. Some of them looked nothing like her. "She's fond of a good story herself," Hamish muttered. Blair's eyes lit with triumph. "There you are, Anderson. Our constable has confirmed our line." Hamish straightened. "I said nothing like—" "You said enough," Blair barked. "We're searching her place." The B&B looked small and frayed in the pounding rain. A few villagers hovered at the gate, pretending to shield themselves with umbrellas, while obviously waiting for a spectacle. Luggs growled low. Hamish wished they would all go home. Mrs. McPhee opened the door. One look at Blair behind Hamish and her face tightened. "You can leave," she said to Blair. "I've done nothing." "Guilty people always say that," Blair replied. Hamish flinched. Luggs bared his teeth. Blair pushed inside without waiting. "Anderson, start in the parlour. I want drawers emptied, letters checked, anything with type." Mrs. McPhee turned to Hamish. "I thought you were here to help me." Hamish tried to speak, but Blair interrupted. "Macbeth has already told me you're fond of stories and secrets." Her eyes flashed. "Did he now?" Hamish stiffened. "I didn't." But she was already moving away, shoulders stiff with hurt. Blair strutted through the hall like a man expecting applause. Anderson opened drawers with unnecessary violence, scattering papers across the floor. "Be careful," Mrs. McPhee cried. "You'll have everything ruined." "You did that yourself," Blair said, playing hostess to strangers at all hours. "Folk are talking." "They're always talking," she snapped. "They talk when a sheep sneezes." Hamish stood awkwardly near the doorway, rain dripping from his coat collar. He caught a glimpse through the window. More villagers gathering in the drizzle, whispering and nudging each other. They loved a scandal more than they loved the truth. Anderson opened a desk drawer and let out a pleased squeak. "Sir, look at this." He pulled out a small, newer typewriter. Not expensive, but newer than anything else in the cottage. Blair seized it as if it were the crown jewels. "There," he shouted. "Proof." Mrs. McPhee's cheeks drained of colour. "I bought that last year to type up guest receipts." Blair waved her explanation away. "You typed the leaflets, you spread them, you tormented that poor writer." Hamish stepped forward. "Blair, the leaflet paper's thinner. This stuff is too thick. And the typeface." "Nonsense," Blair barked. "If it makes letters, it's enough." Hamish shut his mouth. He had made his mistake earlier when he'd muttered agreement. Blair would use that against him now if he pushed back. While Blair ranted, one of the guests, a thin man in a knitted jumper, crept down the stairs. "Excuse me," he said timidly. "I'm sorry, but I did see something. Miss Cole, 2 nights ago. She was arguing with someone near the loch." Blair turned. "Who?" "A man. Tall, wearing a dark coat. I didn't see his face." "Romantic nonsense," Blair scoffed. "Writers are always arguing with someone, probably rehearsing dialogue." The guest flushed. She sounded frightened. "Go on back upstairs," Blair said. "We're doing police work." Hamish watched the man retreat, embarrassed and ignored. Hamish wanted to call him back, but Blair gave him a warning glare. Outside, the drizzle thickened. Voices rose. Someone in the crowd said, "They're dragging out a typewriter. Told you it was her." Another said, "Always thought something was off with that woman." Mrs. McPhee stood rigid, watching her things being poured through. When Blair finally allowed the search to end, he strutted toward the door, shouting, "I'll be back with cuffs if nothing better turns up." As he stepped outside, Luggs growled and snapped at Blair's boot. Blair kicked him away. Hamish's fists tightened. There was no need for that. "Then muzzle your mutt," Blair snapped. "A dog's got more sense than you sometimes, Macbeth." And with that he trudged off to his car, Anderson trotting behind. Mrs. McPhee stood in the wreckage of her parlour. "You told him I make up stories," she said quietly. Hamish swallowed. "I didn't mean—" "You did," she said. "You've let them ruin me. Folk will say I typed every word. They'll never stop." She turned away, leaving him standing in the doorway like an unwanted caller. Rain dripped from his hair down into his collar. Luggs nudged his leg, tail low. The villagers outside dispersed now that the best part was over. A few avoided Hamish's eyes. A few made sure he saw their smirks. He walked back to the station, each step heavier than the last. The wet road gleamed in the thin afternoon light. He could still hear Mrs. McPhee's voice, flat with betrayal. At the station, Hamish sat at his desk and stared at the damp walls. The typewriter on her desk. The wrong paper. Blair's triumph. His own careless words. He'd handed Blair a weapon and watched him swing it. Luggs curled beside him with a soft, disappointed huff. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. "Aye," he murmured. "I made a mess of that." But the mess was only beginning. The wind had teeth that morning, sharp little bites that drove Hamish straight up the path to the Currie sisters' cottage, whether he liked it or not. Their message had been short. "We have information. Come at once." When the Curries summoned, there was never any warmth attached to it, just duty. Luggs trotted beside him, though he slowed as they neared the house, ears flattening as if he smelled trouble. He usually did. Hamish knocked once. The door flew open before his hand dropped. Peggy stood there with her chin up, as though he had committed some offence merely by arriving. "Well, don't stand in the draught," she said. "You'll let the cold in." He stepped inside. Luggs followed reluctantly, pausing long enough to give Peggy a look that would have offended a less self-satisfied woman. The sitting room smelled of boiled cabbage, lavender polish, and the faint, wet odour of a carpet that hadn't fully dried since last week's cleaning. Jessie and Nessie sat stiffly on the sofa, hands clasped on their laps. A tray of tea waited on the table, untouched. Peggy poured it out with the solemnity of a Kirk elder presenting communion. "We asked you here," Jessie began, "to correct a misunderstanding." Hamish took his cup. It was the palest tea he'd ever seen, an insult to leaves everywhere. "A misunderstanding about what?" Peggy exchanged a glance with Jessie. "About these dreadful leaflets going round. Folk are whispering that we, of all people, produced them." Nessie nodded vigorously. "We would never write such wickedness." Hamish took a careful sip. "Someone did." Peggy sniffed. "Someone without morals. Someone with far too much time." He set the cup down. "You said you had information." Jessie shifted. "Only that we object to being slandered. We keep a duplicator, yes, but only for good works." Hamish felt his shoulders tense. "A duplicator?" "Aye," Peggy said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "For Kirk notices, charity announcements, community improvement messages." "I see." He didn't. Not really. Nessie leaned forward, eyes bright with worry or excitement. It was hard to tell which with her. "It's very old. Clatters like a tractor." Hamish folded his long legs awkwardly. Lugs lay by his boot, but kept glancing at the door. "Have you used it recently?" Jessie hesitated. "We produced a sheet about noisy bikers last summer. They were ruining the Sabbath." "That's all," Peggy said sharply. "And you're not to twist that." Hamish felt his patience thinning. "You must tell the truth now. These leaflets have led to a death." Jessie flushed a deep, blotchy red. "Are you suggesting we killed that Englishwoman?" "I'm suggesting nothing." His voice was flat, tired. "I'm asking." Peggy's mouth quivered with outrage. "We write notices to keep the village decent, not to murder folk." "It wasn't a murder," Nessie whispered. "Or was it?" Hamish ignored that. Nessie enjoyed anything that let her wring her hands theatrically. Peggy stood. "Come, we'll show you the machine, and then your suspicions can be properly put to rest." She led him down a narrow hallway that smelled of damp laundry and disinfectant. They entered a cramped back room filled with boxes of hymn sheets, old mugs, and a crocheted cover draped over what Hamish assumed was the infamous duplicator. Peggy whipped the cover off with a flourish. The machine looked like it predated electricity. Rusted rollers, a cracked crank handle, streaked metal plates, a faint film of blue ink smeared along one edge. Hamish leaned down, examining the roller. Even from a glance he could tell the ink texture was wrong, too thick, and the leaflets floating around the village had been printed on thin, smooth paper, not the oatmeal-coloured scraps stacked on a nearby chair. "It doesn't look the same," he admitted. Peggy straightened. "Of course it doesn't. We said so." Jessie folded her arms, her indignation rising like steam. "You barged in here assuming the worst of us. We know what folks say." "I didn't barge," Hamish said mildly. "You sent for me." Peggy waved this away. "Details." Nessie tugged at her sleeve. "Peggy, maybe we should tell him." Jessie's eyes widened in warning, but Nessie rarely managed silence for long. "It wasn't us," Nessie said. "But I did see Miss Cole near the hotel before that happened. She wasn't alone." Hamish straightened. "Who was with her?" Nessie glanced at Peggy, then at Jessie, then back to Hamish. "A woman, a very grand lady with an English voice, arguing, quite sharply." Peggy muttered, "Not our place to say anything." Jessie added, "Folk should mind their own affairs." Hamish stared at Nessie. Her eyes gleamed with a sly sort of satisfaction. She knew exactly what kind of trouble she was stirring. "Who was she?" he asked. Nessie shrugged in a way meant to be delicate. "I don't know, only that she carried herself like someone from a big house." Hamish thought immediately of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was back at Tommel Castle helping her parents. Of course the Curries would love pointing fingers at someone higher up the village ladder. They'd never forgiven Priscilla for being thinner, richer, and immune to their habits of interference. Peggy returned to the sitting room ahead of him, muttering over her shoulder, "We have half a mind to write to Daviot about your behaviour." Jessie nodded. "Coming in here accusing respectable ladies." Hamish rolled his eyes where they couldn't see. "I didn't accuse you." "You implied," Peggy snapped. "Implying is worse." Back in the sitting room the tea had gone cold. Peggy stood by the hearth, stiff as a broom. Jessie sat with tight lips. Nessie perched anxiously, though more excited than distressed. Hamish rose to leave. "If anything else comes to mind—" "It won't," Peggy said. Jessie added, "We've said all we intend." Nessie smiled vaguely, as if pleased with her own contribution. Hamish walked to the door. On the way, he passed the small bin near the sideboard. A scrap of paper lay near the top. He might not have noticed it if Luggs hadn't padded over and sniffed at it, then whined. Hamish bent down, pretending to tie his shoelace. The scrap read "A Voice for Morals" in Lochdu in the same clumsy, self-important phrasing the Curries favoured. It looked like a practice print, uneven letters, misaligned spacing. He folded it quickly and slipped it into his pocket. Nessie's eyes flicked toward the bin. She opened her mouth, but Peggy shot her a sharp glare and Nessie shut it again. Outside, the wind stung his face. Luggs paused at the gate, staring intently toward the direction of Tommel Castle Hotel. Hamish followed his gaze. If Nessie's grand lady existed at all, it pointed him straight to Priscilla. A ridiculous idea. And yet... Don't start imagining things, he told himself. But the doubt stayed. As he walked back through the village, he felt the weight of his mistake with Mrs. McPhee. He had let Blair too far into his head. Worse, he had helped strain a woman's reputation already bruised by gossip. He reached the station with rain gathering again. Luggs shook himself and curled by the stove. Hamish sat, pulled the scrap of paper from his pocket, and stared at the pompous phrase printed across it. A voice for morals in Lochdu. It reeked of the Curries meddling, even if they hadn't meant to harm anyone. Or perhaps they had meant it. He wasn't sure which was worse. Outside, the rain intensified. Inside, the quiet felt uneven and wrong. He had new information, but it only made the ground shift further. He was no closer to the truth, and he'd angered the wrong people. Typical. Hamish set the scrap aside and rubbed Luggs's head. Looks like another mess, he murmured. Luggs sighed with long-suffering agreement. The summons to Strathbane came before Hamish had managed even half a cup of morning tea. The voice on the line was Anderson's, far too pleased with itself. "The chief wants you in at once," he chirped. "Urgent matter." Urgent usually meant Blair had complained. Hamish left Luggs at the station, though the dog whined as if he knew Hamish was heading toward trouble. The drive was long, wet and dull. Rain slapped the windscreen with the same irritation Blair used when he slapped files on desks. By the time Hamish reached headquarters, he felt as stiff as the old chairs in the lobby. Davitt's office was warm, but the atmosphere was anything but. Blair stood to one side, arms crossed, grinning like a man who'd caught a thief. Davitt flicked through a sheet of paper with exaggerated disgust. "You insult respectable ladies," Davitt said. "You ignore crime, and you allow the press to run wild with nonsense about poison pen deaths. Do you enjoy embarrassment, Macbeth?" Hamish stared at a point just above Davitt's balding head. "I didn't insult anyone." Blair slapped the paper. "The Currie sisters say otherwise. They've written a formal complaint. Very detailed." Hamish thought privately that detailed for the Curries meant they'd repeated themselves 10 times and added embroidery. He kept that to himself. Davitt leaned forward. "You will cooperate fully with Inspector Blair. No more independent wandering. No theories without approval. We need control." Blair smirked. "And results." Hamish felt the familiar wave of irritation. "Aye," he said. "Very good." Davitt dismissed him with a twitch of his fingers. Blair followed Hamish out into the corridor, just long enough to whisper, "Try not to muck up again, Macbeth. Some of us are doing actual police work." Hamish headed for the car before he lost his temper. Halfway back to Lochdu, the clouds cracked open briefly, revealing a dull smudge of sun. It did nothing to improve his mood. Tommel Castle Hotel looked grand enough on the outside, though the wind made the place seem colder than it should. Inside, the drawing room was full of nervous guests drinking too much tea. The Halberton Smythes were doing their best to keep spirits high. Colonel Halberton Smythe puffed himself up in that military way he had when trying to look important. Priscilla sat beside her mother, elegant as ever, her expression cool. When Hamish entered, she greeted him with a faint nod that carried all the welcome of a locked door. "Constable Macbeth," she said, "we mustn't alarm the tourists. They're already unsettled." "I've no intention of alarming anyone," Hamish replied. She lifted her chin slightly. "Blair seems to be taking matters in hand." In front of her parents, it sounded like a rebuke. Hamish felt as though he'd been scolded for tracking mud into a school hall. Colonel Halberton Smythe cleared his throat. "Any progress, Macbeth?" "Some." Hamish reached into his pocket. "I need to ask a few people about these leaflets." A man with printer's ink permanently stained into the creases of his hands approached. "Let me see that," he said. "Name's Weir, retired printer." Hamish handed the paper over. Mr. Weir held it up to the light, sniffed, scraped the corner with a fingernail and snorted. "This isn't from any Kirk machine," he said. "That ink's commercial. Big office, publishing place, something with money. And this paper's far too clean, costs a bit." Hamish felt a jolt of interest. "So not from a wee duplicator in someone's cupboard?" Mr. Weir shook his head. "Not unless they're cupboards in a city firm." Hamish tucked that away. The Currie's rusty contraption was out. So was Mrs. McPhee's cheap typewriter. He glanced at Priscilla, who looked faintly uneasy but gave nothing away. "Thank you," Hamish said. Mr. Weir handed back the leaflet. "Someone paid for those," he said. "Folk don't spend on paper like that for gossip alone." Hamish murmured his thanks again and excused himself from the drawing-room. He had no desire to be stared at like some curiosity from the village zoo. He slipped into the servants' hall, where plain tea tasted better than anything offered upstairs. A young maid stood near the sink, drying cups. When she saw him, she glanced toward the door nervously. "I heard you talking about the leaflets," she whispered. "You should know something." Hamish took a seat on a low stool. "Go on." She twisted the towel between her fingers. Miss Cole had all sorts of papers in her room. Sheets covered in blue ink, same smell as the leaflet you were holding. She said she was writing a book about religious hypocrisy, something to do with Highland groups. Hamish frowned. "Did anyone visit her?" The maid nodded slowly. "A man, well-dressed, good suit, came twice, never signed the guest book. He didn't stay." "You didn't tell anyone?" "Didn't think it was my place," she said. "Folk in hotels have their secrets. But after what happened," Hamish thanked her. She scurried off, relieved to have shifted the burden onto him. Blue ink, publishing money, vanity projects, a smooth-talking man appearing off the books, Miss Cole writing about hypocrisy. The pieces were shifting, forming something more complicated than a bored villager stirring trouble. He rose, but the weight of Daviot's warning still sat like a stone behind his ribs. Following this direction meant stepping away from Blair's control. Blair would make him pay for it. On his way out through the back corridor, Hamish paused near the servants' stairs. The hotel felt too still, as though everyone inside feared to breathe too loudly. He rubbed the back of his neck. The place always made him feel awkward and shabby, especially with Priscilla drifting about like some cold angel he couldn't reach. He headed into the rain again. Lugs, waiting at the station door when Hamish returned, looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "Dinna look at me like that," Hamish said. "It's getting worse." He sat at his desk, spreading out the leaflet, the scrap from the Currie's bin, and a few rough notes. None of it fitted neatly. None of it pointed where he wanted. Commercial ink, better quality paper, a man in a smart suit, Miss Cole's blue-stained drafts, and that argument Nessie claimed to have heard with a grand lady. Too many ends, none tied. Hamish leaned back. A droplet of rain from his hair slid down his cheek. Lugs edged closer, pressing against his leg. He could feel the next trap already set. If he followed this new path, he would have to do it without Blair's permission. If he failed, Daviot would come down on him harder than ever. Still, he couldn't ignore it. The poison pen letters were no longer small village spite. Someone with money and purpose was behind them, and Lochdu, always eager for scandal, was ready to believe anything. Hamish closed his eyes briefly. The room felt colder. He opened them again. Nothing had become clearer, but something had shifted. He had no choice now but to follow it. A raw wind worked its way around the station like it owned the place. The door rattled twice before Anderson pushed it open, nearly losing the stack of forms he carried. He always brought more forms when things were already bad. It was his idea of police work. "You'll need to sign these," he said, trying to sound official, though the smugness coming off him was thick enough to taste. "Inspector Blair says Strathbane is taking over all serious leads." Hamish didn't bother standing. "And what's left for me?" Anderson beamed. "Local reassurance work." Lugs, lying by the stove, lifted his head and curled his lip. Anderson laughed nervously. "Dog's in a mood," he said. "Maybe he knows you've been stepping out of line." Hamish took the papers and set them aside. "Any more messages?" "Just that you're not to bother with anything above your station." Blair's words. Anderson adjusted his tie, which only made it more crooked. "He'll be delighted to know you're being supervised." Hamish had no answer to that. The phone rang, shrill and angry, as if Blair himself had stuck his head through the wire. Hamish picked up. Daviot didn't wait for greetings. "I don't appreciate seeing a piece in the Glasgow paper about a Highland poison pen horror." Do you know how fast gossip spreads when a constable fails to keep order? Hamish closed his eyes briefly. Aye, sir, but it wasn't me who talked to the press. Are you accusing my Strathbane officers? Davitt barked. Stick to your crofters, Macbeth. Leave the rest alone. The line went dead. Hamish set the receiver down with a dull thud. Anderson watched him like a well-fed ferret. You heard him, Anderson said. Leave the work to us. Hamish gave him a long, expressionless look. Anderson suddenly found his forms very interesting and slunk out, probably to boast somewhere. Hamish sat for a moment, staring at the cold grate. Luggs came to rest his head on Hamish's boot. The quiet inside the station felt wrong, tight, as if the walls themselves had begun to doubt him. Well, Hamish murmured, they wanted reassurance work. They'll get the opposite. He grabbed his coat, and Luggs followed him out, nails clicking on the floor. At the Strathbane garage, he signed out a police car. He wrote Anderson's name in the log. It was the kind of petty deceit he would usually avoid, but today he felt no guilt. Anderson would be too scared to complain, and Strathbane rarely checked anything unless it involved a missing biscuit tin. Miss Cole's former landlady lived in a shabby grey house in a nearby town, the kind of place with damp creeping into the wallpaper. She answered the door after a long wait and narrowed her eyes at Hamish's uniform. Another policeman, she said. I've told everything already. I'd be grateful to hear it again. She let him inside and motioned him to sit at a table that smelled of furniture polish and old onions. Luggs stayed near the door, mistrusting the house. She was excited about her new book, the landlady said, sitting opposite him. Said it would expose crooks in the church world. A bold thing, considering what she knew. Hamish folded his hands. What did she know? Only what she hinted. That she'd uncovered something nasty. She was getting phone calls, you know. Nasty ones. From a woman with a Highland voice. Hamish stiffened. What kind of calls? Threats. Burn in the papers. That sort of thing. She wouldn't let me listen in. Said it was her battle. Hamish felt a familiar tug. The kind that came when a new path opened but led right back into the same small circle. Mrs. McPhee could be spiteful enough to hiss down a telephone line. The Currie sisters, too. Any of them could unleash venom if given privacy and the excuse of morality. And she told no one else? Hamish asked. The woman hardly talked to me. Just paid the rent and scribbled all night. Writers, the landlady said, as though it clarified everything. When he left, the wind cut straight through his coat. Luggs shook himself and looked up with worried eyes. I know, Hamish said. It's all nonsense until it isn't. He drove back toward Loch Dhu, stopping at Patel's shop. The bell clanged too loudly when he entered. Patel barely looked up from the till, face sour. I suppose you're here to say we're all safe, Patel said. Folk are calling this place cursed. A fisher standing near the newspapers leaned in. I saw a Strathbane car on the road the night that woman died. Not the usual one, something bigger. Hamish turned sharply. Are you sure? The fisher shrugged. Maybe. Hard to tell with the rain. Anyway, business is down. That's the bigger worry. Hamish tried pressing, but it was no use. The fisher was more interested in complaining about tourist bookings than in accuracy. Patel muttered darkly about ruined trade until Hamish gave up and left. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, flinging bits of grit across the road. Luggs stayed close, paws quick on the wet ground. Back at the station, Anderson was waiting by the desk, arms folded like a school prefect catching a boy out of bounds. You've been roaming, he said. Mileage doesn't lie. Hamish pulled off his wet coat. Had to see folk. Blair won't like it. Blair doesn't like anything. Anderson bristled, but another look at Luggs made him think better of replying. Hamish sat heavily in his chair. The station felt even smaller than usual. Davitt's anger, Blair's suspicion, the village's fear, it all pressed in like the damp. His small rebellion had gained him one more vague story in another direction that pointed nowhere. Miss Cole had been threatened. A Highland woman had phoned her. A stranger's car had been spotted. And yet Hamish still circled the same few names, none fitting cleanly. He rubbed his forehead. It's a wonder anyone in this place stays sane, he muttered. Luggs lay down beside him with a defeated sigh. Hamish looked at the blank forms Anderson had left. They waited like patient vultures. The net was tightening, and not around the killer, around him. Grey clouds pressed down on Loch Dhu as if the village had been shoved into a smaller box overnight. The air carried that sour, heavy quiet that meant everyone was talking indoors, and pretending they weren't. Hamish felt it the moment he stepped out of the station with lugs at his heel. Even the dog moved cautiously, nose twitching at shutters half closed in the middle of the day. At Patel's shop, the unease was louder. 2 customers stood at the counter muttering to each other as Hamish came in. They lowered their voices only a little. "You can't stay where such things go on," one said. "It gets into the air." Patel pretended not to hear, but his hands shook as he counted out change. The gossip had begun to settle on him again, as if the leaflet about Mrs. McPhee made folk forget the one attacking him. Hamish bought nothing. He nodded at Patel and stepped back outside, where the cold drizzle felt more honest than anything being said in the shop. Down the road, Mrs. McPhee's B&B looked half asleep. Curtains drawn early, front steps swept too clean. A couple from Edinburgh hurried out with their luggage, passing Hamish with the tight smiles city folk used when they didn't want to be involved. "Lovely scenery," the woman said, not meeting his eyes. "But we won't stay where there's scandal." Her husband added, "Some villages are best avoided until the dust settles." He tugged her toward their car. Hamish watched them go, lugs pressed against his leg. The village had begun its slow punishment of the easiest target. That evening the Kirk Hall filled with bodies and bad temper. The meeting had been called to discuss Christian standards, which meant the Currie sisters had pushed for it. Hamish took a place at the back, lugs lying under his chair like a small protest. The hall smelled of damp coats, starch, old hymn books, and tea someone had forgotten to pour. The Curries sat in the front row, lips thin enough to slice bread. Peggy wore her best cardigan, the one she used for moral judgment. A stern elder stepped to the front. He cleared his throat as if summoning the wrath of heaven. "We are here," he said, "to consider the shame that has been brought upon Loch Dhu. Certain women," he paused meaningfully, "have given cause for outsiders to mock our standards." Mrs. McPhee sat near the aisle. Her shoulders were hunched, but her chin was fixed stubbornly forward. When the elder paused again, she stood abruptly. "You sit there and condemn me," she shouted, "while hiding behind bits of paper someone pushed under a door. You don't know anything." A few gasps rustled through the room. The elder tried to calm her, but she waved him off. "You never liked me," she said. "None of you did. Too many male cousins, too many visitors. That's enough for you to decide what kind of woman I am." Hamish stepped forward a little. "We don't know who wrote those things," he said, raising his voice just enough. "We may be judging the wrong folk." Peggy Currie stood as if yanked by a string. "Oh, we remember your sense of judgment, Constable. You once failed to catch that killer till he came back for more." Her voice was sharp, pleased with itself. "Do you expect us to trust your instincts?" The room shifted. Hamish felt the air tighten. An old case, dragged up and twisted to suit her. The villagers remembered enough to be dangerous. "You always take the side of the wrong people, Constable," someone called. Another voice chimed in. "Maybe you're trying to protect that woman." Lugs let out a low growl. Hamish nudged him quiet, though he agreed with the dog. Near the back, Angus, a crofter known for saying little and meaning less, cleared his throat. "I saw a strange car from Inverness the night that writer died," he said. "Up by the loch." No one turned. They were too busy enjoying their outrage. "Probably nothing," someone muttered. "Stories," another said. Angus tried again. It was late, the kind of car. "Thank you, Angus," the elder snapped, eager to move on. Angus sank back into his seat, unseen again. The meeting surged with talk of respectability and trade. Mrs. McPhee was told she would be removed from the Kirk cleaning rota until matters improved. The vote passed easily. She didn't wait to hear the tally. She fled the hall, head down, tears mingling with the drizzle outside. Hamish followed her into the cold. A few villagers stood smoking under the overhang, watching her go with the blank interest of people observing a sheep wander off the path. He caught up, though she refused to face him. "They can't do that," he said quietly. "They already did." Her voice cracked. "And you let them." Hamish opened his mouth but found nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. Lugs nosed her coat, as if offering the only comfort he knew. She didn't seem to notice. She walked away into the dark, swallowed quickly by rain and humiliation. Hamish stood there until she disappeared. The drizzle thickened, cold and mean, and ran down the back of his neck. He felt it more than he felt the damp settling into his clothes. He had failed her, and worse, he had failed to give the villagers any reason not to turn on her. He walked back toward the hall. The meeting was breaking up. People pouring out wearing satisfied expressions. They had found someone to blame, and what a relief that always was. One woman clutched her coat tight and said to another, "At least we're taking action. Nothing spreads faster than shame." Hamish stepped past them without a word. To argue now would only feed them. Outside, the road shone wet and empty. Lugs pressed against his leg again. The dog's body was warm, but the unease that lay over Loch Dhu chilled everything. Hamish headed toward the station, every step reminding him he had made the wrong call from the start. He hadn't stopped the letters. He hadn't stopped Blair. And now Mrs. McPhee's life was being picked apart by people who had once asked her for extra oatcakes at Christmas. The drizzle turned to a steady fall. Lugs shook himself and looked up, confused by the sudden heaviness in Hamish's pace. "Come on," Hamish murmured. "We're not done with this mess yet." But he didn't believe it. Not then. The night felt long already, and the weight of the village's fear and pride pressed in like a second sky. Morning came with a brittle sort of brightness, the kind that fools no one. The clouds had only climbed high enough to look polite. Hamish stepped out of the station to sweep grit from the step, and Lugs padded beside him, ears twitching. The silence was wrong, too tight, too expectant. A squad car swung into the village square, tyres crunching on the frost. Blair climbed out with a smirk that spread across his face like oil. Anderson followed, carrying a folder as though it were a holy relic. "We're tidying this up," Blair announced. "Some of us like closure." Hamish felt his stomach sink. "What closure?" Blair snapped his fingers. Anderson opened the folder and fanned out the contents. The typewriter dragged from Mrs. McPhee's desk, her stack of unpaid bills, and a handwritten statement from a guest who had once heard her raise her voice about visitors making too many demands. Harassment, Blair said. Motivation. Shame. A woman pushed to the edge. You should have arrested her days ago. Hamish kept his voice even. Tests show the typeface didn't match the leaflets. Not fully. Near enough for the fiscal. Blair jabbed a thumb toward the B&B. "Come along, we're doing this properly." Lugs growled. Anderson stepped behind Blair. The street outside Mrs. McPhee's house was already lined with neighbours, pretending to be out for a morning stretch or a spot of fresh air. Hamish knew better. All of Loch Dhu had a talent for being outdoors when it suited them, especially when something shameful was happening to someone else. Blair banged on the door. Mrs. McPhee opened it, wearing her nightdress under a coat she'd thrown on badly, hair askew. Her eyes were red as if she'd cried already. "What now?" she demanded. Blair gave her a triumphant look. "You're under arrest for harassment, distributing malicious false statements, and contributing to the death of Miss Cole." Hamish flinched at the phrasing. Contributing, as if the woman were some poisonous ingredient. Mrs. McPhee stared, stunned. Then she saw Hamish. "You!" she hissed. "Look what you've done. You stood there and let him." Hamish shook his head. "It's not proven. The test—" "Save it," Blair snapped. "She'll protest plenty at the station." Anderson stepped forward with handcuffs, though Blair snatched them away, eager to perform the gesture himself. He clicked them around her wrists with theatrical efficiency. The villagers leaned in. One muttered, "Knew it." Another said, "Folk like that always show their true colours." A third whispered something about strangers bringing ruin. When Blair marched her down the path, Mrs. McPhee twisted once more toward Hamish. The look she gave him struck harder than any accusation. Her voice was hoarse. "You were supposed to see me right, Hamish Macbeth. You failed." He didn't try to reply. The words wouldn't have mattered. Not in front of this crowd. She was pushed into the car. The door slammed. The engine revved. Blair raised a hand as though delivering some great victory salute. Then the squad car disappeared down the road toward Strathbane. The villagers broke apart in satisfied murmurs, leaving Hamish standing alone in the glare of a sun that gave no warmth. Lugs pressed against his leg, uneasy, confused. "Aye," Hamish muttered. "I dinna like it either." He walked to Tommel Castle Hotel because he couldn't stand the station walls yet. The hotel was quiet at that hour, staff bustling about with determined smiles meant to reassure anxious tourists. Hamish doubted anyone felt reassured. In the drawing room, Priscilla was arranging flowers that didn't need arranging. Her posture was stiff, too stiff to be accidental. "Hamish," she said, voice cool but strained. "Come with me." She led him into a quieter lounge where the carpet swallowed footsteps and every piece of furniture looked like it disapproved of being sat on. She closed the door behind them. "I need to tell you something," she said. Hamish braced himself. Conversations with Priscilla rarely brought comfort. "A man stayed here the night before Miss Cole died," she said in a low voice. "A Glasgow lawyer. He insisted on privacy, used a false name. I thought it was some silly affair he didn't want connected to his wife. I didn't report it." Hamish stared at her. Blair asked, "You told him no unauthorized guests were here?" She lifted her chin. "The hotel's reputation matters, Hamish. I meant to check quietly. I didn't think it mattered." "You chose your folk over the truth," he said, before he could stop himself. Her eyes flickered. "That makes two of us, doesn't it?" He felt the blow, though she had not raised her voice. He turned slightly away. Priscilla opened a drawer in the side table and handed him a folded sheet. "This is the note from his booking. The false name matches a signature on a Lochside cottage lease. I checked after the rumours began." Hamish opened it. The name meant little on its own, but the connection was clear enough. Someone with more money and more secrecy than Mrs. McPhee had reason to hide things. "Why give this to me?" he asked. Her answer was a quiet sigh. "Because Blair will trample everything, and because you'll look at it properly, even if you pretend not to." He pocketed the note, nodded stiffly, and left the hotel before the carpet swallowed him whole. Back at the station, Blair was already on the telephone, boasting to Daviett, who seemed perfectly willing to be impressed. Anderson hovered nearby, looking smug enough to float. "Yes, sir," Blair said loudly. "Swift action. Clean up the village, sir. Macbeth? Oh, he's finally doing as he should." Hamish stepped inside. Blair gave him a look of utter satisfaction. "Paperwork's waiting," Blair said. "You can sign off on my arrest report." Hamish ignored him. He sat at his own desk. Lugg settled beside him, head on Hamish's knee. He unfolded the note Priscilla had given him and stared at the false name. A cottage lease, a hidden guest, a writer with blue ink pages no one understood. None of it pointed to Mrs. McPhee. He had let Blair drag her off like a trophy while the real business slipped further away. Luggs gave a soft, miserable whine. Hamish rested a hand on the dog's head. "Aye," he murmured. "We've made a fine mess now." Outside, the brittle light had faded again, leaving everything grey and thin. Inside, Hamish felt smaller than the room. Hamish woke with the feeling that something else had gone wrong in the night. It wasn't the weather. The wind was the same low moan round the eaves, and the stove had gone out again. It was the scrap of paper on his desk, the one he had taken from the Currie's bin. "A Voice for Morals in Loch Dhu." The pompous title looked worse in the grey morning light. Luggs nudged his elbow as if urging him to do something instead of staring at it. He spread it beside the note with the Glasgow lawyer's false name. Both pieces sat there like awkward guests refusing to look at each other. Blair had told him to stay put, but Blair's orders were usually best ignored. "Come on then," Hamish muttered. He left Anderson a brief note, nothing helpful, and drove out of Loch Dhu before anyone could stop him. The road to the small town where Mr. Weir had once worked was long and empty. Luggs shifted uneasily on the seat. The dog disliked the official cars. They smelled of Strathbane and bad decisions. Weir's old printing shop was now a charity storeroom, but the man himself still lived in a flat above it, and after enough knocking, he opened the door wearing an old jumper, blotched with ink from decades past. "You again," Weir grunted. "I'm not joining any investigation, too old for that." Hamish held out the scrap. "But you printed for them." Highland Moral Voice. Weir stared at the paper. He sighed, shoulders slumping. "Aye, I remember. They were church ladies mostly, all fuss and sighs. Then a smooth-talking chap from Glasgow got involved, said he was helping them spread decency." Weir snorted. "Decency my foot. He paid well, though." "Did he bring his own ink and paper?" "Most times. Better quality than the ladies ever bought. Same stuff as your leaflets, I'd wager." Weir poured tea into chipped cups without asking. "Never liked him. Too careful with his words. And the ladies let him use my duplicator when he brought his own stencils." Hamish felt something shift inside his chest. Not triumph, but a grim click of pieces fitting. "Did he give a name?" Weir scratched his beard. "Not his real one, but he signed a few receipts somewhere. You could ask the charity woman. She's in Inverness now. Moved after her husband took ill." Hamish thanked him and left. The tea had tasted of dust, but the information was clean enough. By the time Hamish returned to Loch Dhu, his jaw was set. He went straight to the Kirk office where the Currie sisters were bent over hymn sheets like disapproving gargoyles. The room smelled of lavender polish and old paper. Jessie froze first. Peggy's hands tightened on a stack of envelopes. Nessie whimpered before anyone spoke. Luggs bristled, a low rumble starting in his throat. Hamish closed the door and turned the key. The click echoed. "Right," he said. "We'll stop the play acting. You printed leaflets for Highland Moral Voice and someone paid you for it. Who was he?" Peggy went white as chalk. Jessie fluttered, then snapped like a cornered hen. "We were doing the Lord's work. That gentleman said it would strengthen morals. There's nothing wrong with that." "Strengthen them by lying about your neighbours?" Hamish stepped forward. "Why did you keep it secret?" Nessie wrung her hands so hard her knuckles reddened. "We only ran off what he gave us. He wrote them. We didn't write the ugly parts, we only helped." "Helped," Hamish repeated. "Is that what you call slipping leaflets under doors?" Jessie lifted her chin. "Folk need guidance. We thought maybe they'd improve if they recognised their faults." Hamish slammed his palm on the table. The sound made all three jump. "You took money to smear people in your village. You enjoyed the power. Don't pretend otherwise." Peggy burst into tears badly. Jessie followed, louder. Nessie hiccuped miserably. "It wasn't supposed to lead to a death," Peggy wailed. "We didn't know that writer-woman would go near the loch. We never met her alone. Never." Hamish's voice stayed cold. "Give me his name." Jessie shook her head violently. Peggy pointed at a drawer with trembling fingers. Nessie fetched a folder from it. Inside was a small white receipt, folded with fussy neatness. Hamish opened it. The signature matched the false name from the Tommel Castle booking, and another scribbled line showed the date the lawyer had hired their duplicator. "It's him," Hamish said quietly. Jessie sniffed. "He said he was part of a respectable charity, that he wanted a moral revival. We thought maybe Lochdu needed one." "Lochdu," Hamish said, "needed a great deal less of you." Peggy gasped at the cruelty of it, but he didn't soften the words. Their meddling had become machinery for blackmail. Their shame now was nothing compared to what they'd sown. "Did you see Miss Cole near the loch?" he asked. Nessie shook her head. "No, we were at home. We were always at home." "For once," Hamish muttered. He tucked the receipt into his jacket. The sisters were still crying when he unlocked the door. He left them with their hymn sheets and their ruined sense of righteousness. Outside, the afternoon had dimmed. Luggs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Hamish felt it too. He had the link he needed, proof that the leaflets came from a scheme far beyond petty village spite. But it was too late for Mrs. McPhee, dragged off in disgrace, and too late, maybe, for him. He walked toward the station with the receipt warm in his pocket and the weight of Lochdu's judgment on his back. Hamish knew something was wrong before he even opened his eyes. Luggs paced beside the bed, nails tapping in short, sharp bursts. The station felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that meant trouble was already waiting outside. Hamish pulled on yesterday's shirt, sniffed it, and decided it wasn't offensive enough to change. The scrap of receipt from the Curries lay atop the table, beside the false name from the Tommel Castle booking. 2 scraps of paper, but they carried more weight than anything Blair had stuffed into his reports. Hamish slid them into his pocket. "Come on, Luggs," he said. "We'll get there first, if we're lucky." The dog didn't look convinced. The road along the loch was chewed by the last night's rain. The puddles reflected nothing but sullen sky. Luggs shifted from side to side on the seat, uneasy. Hamish kept the car slow. He didn't want to skid into a ditch and give Blair something else to laugh at. The hired cottage stood in an awkward crouch between 2 bent pine trees. A few tiles had come loose. The curtains were half drawn. It didn't look like the home of a schemer, but Hamish had learned long ago that appearances rarely helped. As he stepped out, Luggs bounded ahead, then stopped abruptly at a set of fresh tyre tracks curving away from the cottage. The mud was still soft, too soft for a car that had left early in the morning. Hamish crouched, touched the edge of one rut. It came away wet on his fingers. "Someone came back," he muttered, "or never left." Before he could check the cottage door, a siren sliced the mist apart. Luggs whined. Hamish straightened. A Strathbane squad car tore down the lane, spraying gravel like confetti. Blair's face was already twisted with fury before he even braked. "What did I tell you, Macbeth?" he roared, stepping out. "Stay put, but no, you must play hero." "I'm doing my job," Hamish said, though it felt like a weak defence. Blair shoved past him. "Your job? You've caused nothing but mess. Anderson, bring the kit." Hamish followed as Blair stomped toward the road bend, where another car, dark blue, expensive, sat nosed into the heather, engine dead. One door slightly open. The air felt heavier. Inside the car was the Glasgow lawyer, or whatever name he had chosen to use earlier. His head was slumped against the window, hands neat in his lap, eyes half open in a blank surprised stare. Blair let out a sharp, delighted laugh. "There you are. Conscience caught up with him. Suicide, case closed." Hamish stared at the body. Something felt wrong. Too arranged, too polite. Blair leaned into the passenger seat and pulled out a folded page. "And here's our confession, typed on the same machine as the leaflets. He takes full responsibility." Blair waved the paper at Hamish as if expecting applause. Hamish kept silent. He looked at the lawyer's hands. Clean. Far too clean for a man who had supposedly wrestled a car off the road. Not a speck of dust beneath the nails. No mud on the cuffs. "Anderson!" Blair called again. "Radio it in. Tell the fiscal the problem's solved." Hamish stepped away from the car. Lugs pressed close. The mist thinned as they approached the cottage again. The door was unlocked. Hamish pushed it open. The air inside held the faint warmth of a kettle recently boiled. On the draining board were 2 teacups, not one, each still glistening with droplets. One cup bore the faint smear of cheap pink lipstick. He touched the kettle, still warm. "Not alone then," Hamish murmured. Blair stomped inside. "Don't touch anything. You'll contaminate the scene." "Scene of what?" Hamish asked. "Convenient timing?" "Suicide!" Blair barked. "Open and shut. Don't you start inventing mysteries." But Hamish wasn't listening to him anymore. There was a smell lingering in the cottage, a thin floral scent he knew well. One of the village women used it at Kirk. He couldn't place which one yet. Hamish had never been good at remembering names of perfumes, though he usually could identify sheep by smell. Human scents were trickier. Blair strutted around the cottage, barking orders at Anderson, who took notes with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Outside, the mist began to settle again. Word travelled fast in Loch Dhu, as it always did. By the time Hamish returned to the village, the gossip had forked into 2 opposing floods. "Of course this proves Mrs. McPhee did it," one voice said. "It clears her," another answered. "The lawyer confessed." Neither side cared for evidence. They cared for the comfort of whichever story suited them. Hamish trudged up the station steps. Blair was already on the phone to Davitt, preening like a rooster. "Yes, sir," Blair said loudly. "Swift closure. My team handled it perfectly. Macbeth?" "Oh, aye," he assisted, though he nearly spoiled things with his notions. Hamish shut the office door before Blair could turn it into another monologue. He didn't sit. Lugs nudged his hand, uncertain. The floral scent in the cottage, it had clung to something in his memory. A Kirk woman. Frequent cheap perfume. Something slightly powdered. Priscilla appeared in the doorway, startling him. She looked pale, her expression unreadable. "Hamish?" she said quietly. "I heard about the man. It feels too neat." He grunted. "Aye." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. He'd made enough mistakes aloud for 1 week. She stepped back, her face tightening. "Be careful." And then she was gone again, swallowed by the corridor's dim light. Hamish breathed out, long and slow. He should have listened to Angus earlier. Properly listened. He walked out to the crofter's small shed where Angus was trimming wire from a broken net. "You wanted to tell me something before," Hamish said. Angus looked up, surprised to be remembered. "Aye. The night that woman died, I saw a car from Inverness stop near the cottage. Not late, but late enough. A woman got out. Smallish, coat pulled tight. Couldn't he see her face?" "You sure it was a woman?" "Aye, walked like one. And the coat had one of those furry collars. I remember that." Hamish's mind clicked again. The perfume, the coat, the sudden spending. He thanked Angus and headed toward the village stores. Patel raised an eyebrow when Hamish stepped in. "You here for trouble or biscuits?" Patel asked. "Maybe both," Hamish said. "Who bought a new washing machine recently?" Patel sniffed. "Angus's sister, last week. And a coat. Horribly cheap thing." "Where'd the money come from?" Patel gave a tight smile. "Ask her. She said charity work's finally paying off." Hamish left the shop feeling the first real certainty he'd had in days. Angus's sister. Quiet, helpful, always around the Kirk office. The charity's bank book under her control. And suddenly buying appliances she could never normally afford. He returned to the station. Luggs thumped his tail, sensing the shift. Hamish lowered himself into his chair and stared at the receipt, the false name, and the lingering scent that followed him in memory. He had the shape of the truth now. But he also knew Blair would fight it. Daviot would dismiss it. And the village, proud, frightened Loch Dhu, would not thank him for unpicking the neat ending they'd decided to believe. He rubbed Luggs's ears. "Too late to stop now," he said. The dog sighed, settling against his leg, and Hamish stared at the door, knowing the next step would be worse than any he had taken so far. The cold settled over Loch Dhu in a way that made even the birds give up. Hamish felt it clamp round his shoulders as he headed up the muddy track to Angus's cottage. Luggs trotted ahead but kept stopping to look back, as if trying to warn him that whatever waited inside was best left alone. Hamish ignored the dog and pushed on. The cottage windows glowed faintly, though the rest of the place looked the same tired grey as everything else in Loch Dhu that morning. When Hamish opened the door without knocking, Luggs hesitated on the threshold, nose wrinkling. Inside, Morag sat by the fire, knitting with brisk, angry movements. The new washing machine hummed in the corner. It looked ridiculous in the cramped room, the sort of thing bought quickly and without thought, like a guilty conscience. Angus stood against the wall, hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at nothing. Hamish closed the door. He walked to the table and laid down the receipt from Highland Moral Voice and a photocopy of the charity's bank book. "You've had a busy year," he said mildly. Morag's needles stopped, just for a second. Hamish went on. "Miss Cole found out the charity money was vanishing, wee bits at first, then more. That Glasgow lawyer of yours thought he could squeeze extra out of you with these leaflets. A moral campaign, he called it." Hamish glanced at the humming machine. "Did he ask for his share raised, that right?" Morag sniffed loudly. "I dinna know what you're talking about. You police think you know everything." Hamish sat down opposite her. "No, I usually get it wrong." He pushed the papers closer. "But not this time." Angus swallowed hard, but said nothing. Hamish kept his voice flat. "You met Miss Cole by the loch. She confronted you. You shouted or shoved, or maybe she slipped trying to get away from you. And when she died, you told yourself it was an accident. But the lawyer didn't think so. He came to the cottage to tighten his hold on you." Morag's mouth pinched. "You've no proof." "I have 2 teacups, one with lipstick, the same cheap stuff you wore to Kirk last week." He watched the colour drain from her cheeks. "I have Angus saying he saw a woman get out of that Inverness car. I have money missing from the account. And I have a lawyer who ended up dead in his own motor after having tea in your cottage." "That was suicide," she muttered. "His hands were clean," Hamish said. "Too clean. You tidied him away." Angus let out a low groan. Morag shot him a furious look. "Shut your mouth. You've said enough already." Hamish rose. "You're done lying. You pushed her, or frightened her, and then you killed him because you wanted more than you could hide." Morag's needles clattered to the floor. "I never meant it to go so far," she said, voice trembling with anger rather than sorrow. "It was just money at first. Folk like us never get chances. Those church ladies looked down on me. Everyone did. They laughed at us all our lives." Hamish reached into his pocket and brought out the handcuffs. He didn't give her a speech. He simply said, "Stand." Morag's eyes darted toward Angus as if hoping he'd intervene, but Angus only whispered, "Morag, why did you not tell me?" She didn't answer. Hamish cuffed her wrists. She didn't fight. He used the landline to call Strathbane. Blair arrived like a storm cloud running late. He stood in the doorway, sour and triumphant at the same time. "So, the village idiot got there first," Blair said. "Daviot'll want to hear how I guided you the whole way." "You guided nothing," Hamish replied, too tired to sharpen it. "She confessed." Morag scowled. "He tricked me." Blair seized her arm. "That's what they all say." He marched her out, Anderson bustling behind, dropping his notebook twice in his excitement. Angus sat heavily in a chair. Hamish paused at the door. "I'm sorry," he said. It wasn't enough, but it was all he had. Late afternoon found Hamish standing awkwardly in Mrs. McPhee's doorway. She was back home, released without apology, her kitchen smelling of yesterday's tea and bitterness. "You're cleared," Hamish said. The truth came out. Mrs. McPhee didn't invite him in. "A fine bit of help you were," she said coldly. "Quick enough to doubt me. Quick enough to let the others do it too." "I made mistakes," Hamish said. "Aye," she answered, "and I paid for them." She closed the door. Hamish let it shut. Back in the village, the Currie sisters had already regained their stiff smiles, though people now looked at them with suspicion rather than admiration. Their standing had cracked, but not enough to humble them. Gossip said they had been bullied by Hamish, manipulated by outsiders, and ruined by their own goodness, depending which neighbour one spoke to. At the Kirk gate, 2 women whispered about the disgrace. When Hamish passed, one of them said pointedly, "It's a pity those with authority don't think before they roar." He didn't bother responding. Lochdu's memory was long only when it suited them. Tommel Castle was quiet when Priscilla asked him to come in for coffee. He followed her to a small room where the light was dim and the scent of coffee mingled with polished wood. "I heard about Morag," Priscilla said softly. "You did well." Hamish shook his head. "Too late for the folk I hurt." She studied him with that cool, careful gaze of hers. "I'm sorry for keeping that guest secret. You were right to be angry." Hamish gave a weak smile. "If I held grudges, I'd have no one left to talk to." "That's not true," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. They finished their coffee in awkward silence. When she finally stood, Hamish knew the distance between them was wider than before. He made a joke about catching up on paperwork, but it fell flat. He left shortly after. Evening settled over Lochdu with thin drizzle, the kind that soaked everything without making a fuss. Lugs padded close beside him. The village had already started its new stories, about how they'd all suspected Morag, about how Morag had seemed off for years, about how Lochdu always exposed wickedness in the end. Hamish knew better. Lochdu protected its own until it didn't, and when it turned fast and without mercy. He reached the station and lit the peat fire. The flames caught slowly, spitting now and then. Lugs curled beside him with a sigh. The poison pen game was finished, but its stains would linger on people long after. Mrs. McPhee would never trust him again. The Currie sisters would nurse their wounds in the way only Highland spinsters could, quietly and without forgiveness. Priscilla would stay polished and distant. And Hamish, tall and lanky in the quiet glow of the fire, remained what he always was, a constable tied to a village that loved him only when it cost them nothing. He poked the fire, watching sparks leap and die. "Another fine job," he murmured to Lugs. The dog thumped his tail once without conviction.